Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to part one of the Tocqueville Center's September event. My name is Brent Nelson, and I'm the interim director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society, and a professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. The Tocqueville Center is dedicated to exploring the big questions asked by the best minds in the Western tradition. Alexis de Tocqueville, the 19th century French aristocrat, social scientist, philosopher, and politician, is one of those great minds. His classic book, Democracy in America, is still a must-read for all students of politics, especially students of democracy. This year, the Tocqueville Center is honoring the legacy of its namesake by focusing on topics in which Tocqueville was particularly interested. This month, we are examining Protestant religion in America. If you would like to see other topics we are exploring this fall, there is a brochure available for you in the Political Science Department, Politics and International Affairs, where you can look and see what the coming speakers are. The spring schedule has also been announced, and a brochure will be published later this term. We will be welcoming to campus such luminaries as Robert Putnam, David Brooks, Helen Andrews, and Patrick Deneen, among many others. You'll not want to miss this spring program. Tonight, we will start our deep dive into a characteristic of America, Tocqueville, in the early 19th century, identified as crucial to understanding the nature of democracy in this country, namely its Protestant religious landscape. Most early European settlers of North America were products of the 16th century Reformation that shattered Catholic Christendom and spawned countless breakaway religious fragments united only in their opposition to Rome. Many of those fragments made their way to America, where they found even more ways to divide. But despite its fragmented nature, Protestantism as a whole remains influential in our contemporary culture and politics. Thus, to help us understand the impact of Protestantism on today's America, we will hear from two prominent observers of religion in the U.S., who will then be joined by our other two guests, whom we will hear from tomorrow night in part two of this event, for a panel discussion that will include questions from the audience. But before I introduce the speakers for the evening, let me first read Furman's Standards of Comportment, which we are required to read before each CLP. This event is part of the university's Cultural Life program, which provides opportunities for students to participate in a variety of educational and enriching cultural experiences. Through these events, students encounter a spectrum of ideas, issues, opinions, and artistic expressions from various disciplines and cultures. CLPs invite meaningful dialogue, leading to a healthy understanding of and respect for differences. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the positions of the university. All participants are expected to display respect for the presenters, performers, and audience members, keep an open mind in the presence of new ideas and opinions, and conduct themselves with civility. In turn, all presenters are also expected to encourage productive and responsible conversation consistent with the mission and values of the university. And before we begin, silence your phones. Thank you. Now, to the main event. Our first speaker tonight is Molly Worthen. Molly is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a freelance journalist. She received her BA, MA, M.Phil, and Ph.D. from Yale University. Her research focuses on North American religious and intellectual history. Her most recent book, Apostles of Reason, examines American evangelical intellectual life since 1945, especially the internal conflicts among different evangelical subcultures. Worthen writes regularly about religion, politics, and higher education for the New York Times and has also written for the New Yorker, Slate, the Atlantic, and other publications. She's currently writing a book about the history of political and religious charisma in America. And following Molly will be our second speaker, Emma Green. Emma Green is an award-winning journalist and writer. She worked as a staff writer for The Atlantic, where she covered religion and politics. She is now a staff writer for The New Yorker, where she covers cultural conflicts in academia. She is also a frequent contributor to the opinion pages of major news outlets. Ms. Green has won several awards for her writing, including Religion News Association's First Place Award in Religion News Analysis and the George W. Hunt S.J. Prize for Journalism. She graduated from Georgetown University. They will now speak one after the other, and then we will have our panel discussion. So Molly, please. Let's welcome Molly Worthen.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks especially to Brent and Jim and everyone at the Tocqueville Center for putting together this terrific event and including me in this group. I'm really looking forward to the conversations both tonight and tomorrow. I would like to use my time this evening to talk about two forces that I think have been really important in Protestantism and I think in American culture more generally over at least the past generation. The first is what Pentecostal and Charismatic Christians call manifestations of the Holy Spirit. And the second is the rise of figures we could call spiritual and political gurus who convince followers that they can manifest the reality they choose. The basic paradox I'm interested in is that in this so-called age of secularization, when we hear a lot about declining rates of church attendance and growing numbers of people who affiliate with no religion at all, these kinds of statistics, I think you could argue that we are also seeing a growing number of Americans engaging with what they believe are supernatural forces. Let me start with a short story. About 15 years ago, when I was in graduate school, I spent 2 weeks doing research at a place called L'Abri, which is a somewhat famous in evangelical circles, evangelical Christian commune in the Swiss Alps near Geneva. When I was there, it attracted a lot of American and Canadian evangelical Protestants, college students or recent college graduates who were usually there trying to sort out questions about their faith. I had a conversation with one girl named Nicole. She grew up outside of Vancouver. She was a couple years outside of college herself. She was, at the time, teaching English in France for her job. And she was at L'Abri for part of the summer, kind of a spiritual retreat. She told me that she grew up vaguely Presbyterian, but in France, she was living with a Pentecostal family. And this was making a huge impact on her. I was going over my notes from that summer, and here's one thing she said, and I'm quoting her here. They believe in the power of the Holy Spirit. They pray expecting an answer. I'd never seen that before. To see people who really believed it was shocking to me, and it frustrated me that it shocked me. So she got hungry for something like this sense of real expectation that God will act in her own faith. She wanted that for herself. She had become really close to her host mother, and this woman told Nicole about various healing miracles that she had witnessed. She described in detail this little girl who had a crippled, foreshortened arm, and she saw the arm grow longer and functional before her eyes. Now, Nicole, given her upbringing, she was wired to be super skeptical of stories like this, but she had come to really know this woman and trust her, and so she found she had to take the story very seriously. On the other hand, she also told me about how Pentecostal culture really frustrated her, how it seemed like there wasn't a lot of room for people who doubt, who find that God keeps saying no to prayers. Nicole was on a quest, I think, for a balanced relationship to certainty. I really admired this about her. I tell you about her because I think her story illustrates two basic points. The first is that very weird stuff happens to people all the time. There are many perfectly normal, rational people who will tell you crazy stories of healings and other things that they have experienced or seen that they view as miracles. And I think secular scholars and a lot of Western Christians do not have great tools for making sense of this. They just kind of put it over here and pretend it's not going on. Number two, people crave a kind of existential and moral certainty that the universe cannot actually provide. I think this is true whether you are a religious believer or an atheist. And sometimes as humans, we cope pretty well with that craving, but sometimes it leads us down dangerous paths. Now, when I talk about Pentecostalism and the broader family of charismatic Christianity, I'm talking about the religious tradition that goes back to the first Christian Pentecost in the book of Acts, this idea that the Spirit can descend on Christians and do wondrous things, give them powers to speak languages they've never studied, conduct miraculous healings, give them the gift of prophecy, or even just compel them to suddenly lose all control of their bodies. If you scan the great sweep of Christian history, going back all the way to the beginning, you find the Holy Spirit showing up in striking ways here and there, although different groups of Christians, of course, understand these phenomena very differently. In America, the first and second Great Awakening, so those big revivals in the early mid-18th century, early mid-19th century, they were full of what critics called enthusiasms. People falling down, slain in the Spirit is the phrase, lying catatonic in trances for hours, laughing for hours, making weird animal noises, claiming miraculous healings, all of that stuff. So you have this kind of ebb and flow of these kinds of phenomena, being reported throughout the centuries. And then this periodic Spirit-filled revival, it gets sort of supercharged with the birth of modern Pentecostalism at the turn of the 20th century, with William Seymour leading big revivals in Los Angeles, and this movement of people speaking in tongues and having these just wildly exuberant physical experiences. This movement, within a decade, it spreads to every inhabited continent. It's really a worldwide phenomenon. Later in the 20th century, say really getting going in the 60s, although we could play with the dates, you have more churches which did not consider themselves Pentecostal. Churches, both Protestant and Catholic, opening up to the possibility of spiritual gifts, but not necessarily saying you must speak in tongues to possess what Pentecostals would call the full gospel, not treating it as kind of a litmus test. So this is where that broader label, charismatic, is helpful. According to the Public Religion Research Institute, Pentecostals and charismatics account for something like 23% of all American Christians. So that's about 50 million people, although I think that really undercounts because there's a way in which that later charismatic revival, the one that started in the 60s, has sort of leached into just loads of churches that still would not label themselves charismatic, but have adopted some of that openness to praying in tongues and expecting that kind of physical experience, those encounters with the miraculous. There may be something like 665 million Pentecostals and charismatics worldwide. That's one figure I've seen. The political scientists may have better numbers. One interesting estimate I have seen is that by the year 2050, 1 in 10 people on the planet will be Pentecostal. I would contend that the Pentecostal charismatic revival is the single most important force in the last 120 years in American Christianity and in world Christianity. Over the past few decades, first mainline denominations, then evangelical denominations started to report declines in membership numbers, church attendance. Pentecostals, I think to an interesting degree, have resisted that trend, not entirely, but in a meaningful way, either growing, continuing to grow, or declining at a much smaller rate than other groups in recent years. Lifeway Research, which is a Southern Baptist polling firm, found that 57% of Pentecostal pastors reported, this is in the United States, reported that for every 100 people they have in their congregation, they saw 10 new people join becoming Christians. This data is 3 or 4 years old. So that's a higher rate of people becoming Christians in these churches, significantly higher than any other denomination that Lifeway surveyed. And worldwide, I mean, as far as I can tell, we are in the middle of a global Pentecostal revival that started in the 60s, 70s, and is still going. In the U.S., immigration from the global south is bringing more people to this country who either are already Pentecostal or they are joining immigrant communities where Spirit-filled churches have a big presence. So I think as we continue to see the browning of America demographically, we will continue to see the Pentecostalization as well. I think the political consequences of this are still unclear. I've noticed that people on the right like to think that all Pentecostals will automatically prioritize conservative culture war issues, while people on the left seem to assume that if a person is not white, then he or she is automatically a Democrat. And both views are way too simplistic. Many scholars would want to explain the growth of Pentecostalism by pointing to demographics of immigration, high birth rates, the emphasis on evangelism. That's all fine, useful. Sometimes you get a kind of condescending analysis that says that people in poor developing countries are just so desperate, they have such poor access to medical care, they'll believe anything, they'll pray anything. And I think there are giant problems with that line of thinking. My sense is that there is another factor to acknowledge here, and that is that a lot of people become Pentecostals, stay Pentecostal, because they personally experience unexplainable phenomena that they understand to be miracles. I have talked to a respectable, very nerdy neuroscientist in Indiana who believes that God healed his brain tumor. I've interviewed a surgeon in Florida who claims that he raised a man from the dead through prayer. Now, of course, Catholicism also has a very rich tradition of the miraculous, but I think for Pentecostals and Charismatics, the experience of miracles, the thirst for miracles, it has a particularly Protestant tinge, one that really goes back to the old Puritan hunger for the conviction of personal assurance of God's salvation, to personally feel God's finger on your shoulder, tapping, saying, "You are mine." I don't see that desire going away. This desire is not just a Christian thing, and this is my next major point. For a long time, Americans have been very inclined, I think more than other cultures, to the smorgasbord sort of DIY approach to personal spirituality, to sort of pick ideas and practices from here and there and sort of make your own faith that works for you. And I think we're seeing a real uptick in that, even as the number of the so-called nones, the people with no religious affiliation, continues to rise. Pew recently found that 62% of all U.S. adults say they believe in at least one New Age idea. So this means ideas like there's a spiritual energy that permeates our world that has a certain power, or psychics can predict the future and see things they shouldn't be able to see. Reincarnation, beliefs like this. I spent some time interviewing women who work in the growing field of what's called spiritual coaching, where they help clients, who are also almost entirely women, build a plan for personal success that draws on a wide range of Christian and New Age and Eastern ideas. One coach told me that depending on a client's taste, like what they think's interesting, what they think's just way too weird, she might draw on her training in Reiki, energy healing, or crystals, just sort of go with the flow of the person's religious upbringing, and come up with a package that works. All these women share in common the idea that you can manifest the reality that you want in life through a combination of positive thinking and, I guess, what we might call tactics to manipulate spiritual forces in the universe, or sort of align yourself with the universe. And one pattern I noticed is that their clients, and the women themselves too, the women who become spiritual coaches, have often had really bad experiences with medical experts or traditional higher education. So they are inclined at this point in their lives to be super skeptical of the establishment, of men in lab coats saying they know what's wrong, and to think they should just go it alone and trust their intuitions. And in a way, this is itself a very Protestant impulse, to have this sense that the real sort of source of truth is inside you, is your own relationship with the divine. Loads of Americans, by the way, don't see any of this New Age stuff or embracing pieces of Eastern religions as mutually exclusive, with also calling themselves Presbyterian or Lutheran or whatever. It kind of reminds me how you can go back and read the sermons of the great Puritan preacher Cotton Mather in the mid-late 17th century and see him railing at his congregation. Right? These are like hardcore Puritans, Massachusetts Bay, right? Railing at them for carrying around rabbit's feet and believing in the evil eye and potions with the eye of newt and other pagan superstitions, essentially, which they saw as not making them any less Christian, but just sort of covering their bases, right? So here again, I think we see this human desire for contact with the supernatural, for confirmation that the universe is on my side, and this desire to be part of a story that has transcendent meaning, that tells me that my suffering, my own private miseries, the crummy stuff that's happened to me and my family, it's not just chaos. It makes a certain amount of sense. I think this is a universal human impulse that shows up in some way in every culture and every historical era. And by itself, it is not necessarily admirable, and it's not necessarily regrettable. It just sort of is what it is. I'll end with one last thought, and this is more of a concern. I think that in our current media landscape and political moment, this impulse to trust a guru who offers you a more appealing reality, a sense of contact with something bigger than you, with forces bigger than you, this does have real political consequences. Americans have become, in recent years, I think, more vulnerable to figures maybe we could call peddlers of anti-fact alternative realities. You can find cases of this across the political spectrum, absolutely. But the political science data I've seen sort of sees more of it on the right. And I think there are historical reasons why we're seeing a bit more of it on the right end of the political spectrum. For one, there is a longer tradition of distrust of elite experts on the right. So there is a way in which the spiritual story that I'm telling you has become intertwined with political and media history that goes back at least to, say, Rush Limbaugh and the explosion of conservative talk radio gurus in the 1990s, and then kind of metastasizes in the age of the internet with Breitbart and Fox and Newsmax and Trump's Twitter account, all that. We want the power to manifest our preferred reality. We want a guru to tell us how, or maybe it's more accurate to say we want the guru to give us the quote-unquote facts and then encourage us to make up our own minds. I think that's what we think we are doing, all of us, because this is a Protestant culture where we treat the idea of free conscience and making up your own mind as an individual as sacrosanct. And we're not always as aware of all the other factors that shape how we make decisions as we ought to be. All this is to say that if you define secularization as the decline of institutions, the rise of religious pluralism, a new kind of compromise that has to happen in the public square, then yes, we live in a secular age. If, however, you want to define it as humans becoming more materialist in how they understand the universe, more naturalist, becoming better able to reasonably and sort of dispassionately evaluate empirical evidence, less shaped by the particularly Protestant culture of America, less interested in transcendent meaning, then the answer is absolutely not. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First, I want to say thank you. Thank you to Brent and to Jim, to Lizzie, who's been really helpful in getting our arrangements to come here. And thank you to Alexis de Tocqueville. I'm so thrilled to be here at an event hosted by the Tocqueville Center because, unbeknownst to our gracious hosts before they invited me, I'm actually something of a Tocqueville girl. I wrote my undergraduate thesis in part on Tocqueville. And when I was a young woman in my early days of the internet, I actually convinced one of my editors to let me Photoshop a pair of sunglasses and a football onto the classic portrait of Alexis de Tocqueville to go with a story that was being published about communities and life in America, which I consider one of the greatest coups of my career. So this is a great reunion with a figure who I love dearly and whose great text, Democracy in America, I've considered to be a touchstone for my work, intellectually and also as a text to return to over the years. It's also wonderful to be here with Molly and with Eric and Ryan tomorrow night. Can't wait to hear what you have to say, and great to be here at Furman. Often my work, in the biggest picture sense, focuses on a single question: can we live together? And this often plays out in so many different spheres. For many, many years, I covered religion and politics, so I wrote about this in the context of religious communities. Today, I have a broader ambit of covering lots of culture war issues, issues that tend to be the most tender and divisive. But ultimately, I think this question is a Tocqueville question. He comes to America and he sees all of these small communities, these little laboratories of democracy, and he also sees that Americans are sort of these unwashed, slightly disgusting people who he's not quite sure are capable of a civilized society, and he wonders to himself, can they live together? They do all these town hall meetings. I love that. That seems very interesting for democracy. But on the other hand, they seem quite querulous. So I would say that that spirit survives today and is something that's endlessly fascinating to me as I get to report around the country and meet lots of different people. This question, can we live together, is often posed in the American Protestant sphere about one segment of Protestants, which is evangelicals, and specifically white evangelicals. And I think the reason why this question gets posed about this group, especially in my line of work in journalism, is that in polling, in our sort of abstract ways of understanding this religious group and others, white evangelicals are pretty distinctive. They tend to cluster together on polling questions about all sorts of issues, including political ones. And when they cluster together, often the picture that one could paint is that they tend to cluster around questions of immigration, of LGBTQ rights, the rights of religious minorities, and other issues where the vision that seems to emerge is one less of pluralism than of wanting to create solid boundaries, one of trying to create a sort of defined community that isn't one that creates space for living together in a pluralistic democracy. Two examples of stats stand out to me to represent the ways in which white evangelicals stand out from other religious groups and other groups generally on their attitudes on contemporary issues, and also show how contemporary issues are so charged within this community. I was looking today at Pew's great data on evangelicals, and one stat showed that 68% of white evangelicals think that America has gone too far in accepting transgender individuals in any way. And from the Public Religion Research Institute, 65% of white evangelicals think that discrimination against whites has become just as big of a problem as discrimination against black Americans. And that number was actually higher in the summer of 2020 and the several months afterwards, after the George Floyd protests. I think these stats and this story that I just told you, that I just rehearsed for you, capture something that's real about this segment of the American Protestant world, or at least certain neighborhoods of it. A sense of embattlement around hyper-aware racial politics, a sense of the culture changing rapidly on foundational issues, such as how we understand the difference between men and women. But I have also found in my work, and maybe I'll differ here from some of the political scientists in the audience, I'm sure Ryan might take issue with this, that statistics can be flat, that they can tell a story that doesn't have enough texture, it doesn't have enough complexity. And the stories that I love best, that I love to go out and actually report and have curiosity about, are often about the conversations not about this community against other communities, but rather within communities, within the evangelical world. So I have 4 stories for you this evening about this world, the white evangelical world, although I'll complicate that and expand it a little bit. And these are 4 stories about this big question: can we live together? And I hope that these stories will be surprising, maybe complicated, and I hope that in the end that it will help to illuminate a little bit better, with a little bit more complexity, this question of how the evangelical world, which is big and diverse and complex, fits into our American political life, and especially at this moment when it's unclear as a country how we answer this question: can we live together? The first person I want to introduce you to is Kathy Lee. I began corresponding with her many, many years ago, more than I would like to count. And it started with an email from what I would consider a burner account, a burner Gmail account that you can't really identify. And it was essentially sending me a link, and I get these kinds of emails all the time. It was interesting. And I sort of disregarded it, said thank you, moved on. The correspondence kept coming. And I started to notice a pattern over time, that the emails were always about a very niche area of interest, which I think is interesting, but would not resonate with many people, which was about LGBTQ issues in Christian higher education. Always, that's what the links were about. And over time, as I got to correspond with this correspondent, who went by Kay Lee on her burner account, she disclosed to me that she was a gay individual, that's how she identified, at a Christian higher education university who was closeted. She wouldn't tell me where, she wouldn't tell me what, and I didn't push. Over the years, we started to hit up a correspondence. We would go back and forth about different things that were happening in the news. She would send me links. And before too long, we started having phone calls. And I didn't exactly know what would happen about my interest in Kaylee, whether there would ever be a story about her. But I knew that she was interesting. She was a figure who was caught an attention point in a community where these issues have been very fraught and very hard to navigate. As I got to know her better, I realized that she is your sort of stereotype of a very polite, somewhat formal, easily to blush type of woman, the kind of woman that you would expect to see next to you in the pew at church. I found out later about her that when she went to her very first Pride Parade, which was many, many, many years into her life when she was in her 60s, she wore a white t-shirt and slacks and was very embarrassed about all of the revelry that was going on. She mixes up gender pronouns for non-binary and trans students, just like many other people of her age set. She's someone who you wouldn't stereotype as someone who's sort of an activist for LGBTQ issues. This is perhaps attributed to her cultural upbringing and her long years in Christian higher education. She was the poster girl for Christian higher education. At one time, she wrote an editorial in Christianity Today where she extolled the virtues of being able to go to a specifically Christian school and be able to learn academics alongside theology. But she was also, during those long years in Christian higher education, in the closet. It was a truth that she barely acknowledged to herself for years. Maybe she would have conversations, she would have relationships, but not romantic relationships, just strong relationships with women that she never really developed into anything. And it took her being pretty late into her career in her 40s at a college called Eastern in Pennsylvania, and it's another Christian college, having a bunch of artsy poet professor friends who helped her to sort of come to terms with her own identity. She was closeted there. And shortly afterwards, she decided to go back to Whitworth, which is a school in Washington State. And it's a school where she had taught early in her career. And she wasn't sure what the environment would be like there for someone like her if it were to be found out that she is gay. She sort of felt around before she went and finally decided to make the jump. Whitworth is a really interesting institution because it defies the stereotypes that one might have about Christian higher education. It occupies a sort of middle ground. One of the people I spoke to who's in leadership there talked to me about this phrase, walking on the narrow ridge, this idea that the school tries to follow a line where they don't fall too far on the side of dogma and theology, and they don't fall too far on the side of secular, liberal, scientific thought. They're trying to walk the narrow ridge between the two of those. The way that Whitworth had approached this topic, which actually is surprisingly true at many, many, many evangelical institutions of higher education, had been silence. It was ambiguity. They didn't have a policy articulated on biblical sexuality. They didn't have a statement that faculty had to sign, in particular, committing themselves one way or another. But they also didn't have a hiring policy that protected people who identified as gay. Kathy stayed in the closet at Whitworth until 2017, so about 6 years after she had started working there. There was something about Trump, something about getting older, something about having students come to her to talk about their closeted identities and having to lie to them that I think finally motivated her. She sent a letter to the president of the school, Beck Taylor, and she came out. And according to Kathy, he was kind and gracious, and then nothing happened. All over the Christian higher education world, similar dynamics were playing out, but with much bigger fireworks. Huge fights at Baylor and Calvin and Seattle Pacific, professors at Milligan College in Tennessee and Malone in Ohio losing their jobs after coming out or after getting married. Kathy had tapped into something that was dangerous. It was dangerous to engage with. It was dangerous to face head on because ultimately it's an issue that Christian communities, and in particular Christian communities of higher education, have found difficult to answer that question on, can we live together? Whitworth in particular, I think, was trapped between constituencies, students and professors that favored a more open policy on LGBTQ issues, alumni and trustees and certain theology professors who favored a more conservative or orthodox theological approach on biblical sexuality. A year after my story came out, Whitworth changed its policy. And it was a year after Kathy's retirement. It added sexual orientation to its list of protected employment characteristics, but continued to maintain that sex is for committed monogamous relationships. It didn't add gender identity to its list of protected categories. It was a middle ground. They tried to find their way along the narrow ridge. Kathy, in typical form, wrote to me, taking it all in. She seemed to feel very, very happy that this step had been taken, but also a little dissatisfied that the consensus that Whitworth had come to for its community didn't come all the way around to the position that she wanted. This landing spot was an in-between place, and that's what I found in my reporting, that a lot of communities that have struggled with this issue, LGBTQ issues, which come up all the time in evangelical worlds, are actually stuck in that in-between place, trying to find that place of negotiating between theology, institutions, and individuals, and trying to make sure that none of those things get lost in whatever solution that they come up with. The next person I want to introduce you to is named Rebecca Schrader. I started talking to Rebecca many years ago because her story was, on its face, fascinating. She worked as a sonographer, a technician who takes ultrasounds on pregnant women in Durham, North Carolina. She grew up in a small community. Faith was a huge part of her life. She volunteered at a crisis pregnancy center, which are pro-life centers that encourage women who are facing unexpected pregnancies to not seek abortion. And she would do the ultrasound at those crisis pregnancy centers. All of these things guided Rebecca to want to have a family, and when she found out she was pregnant, she was elated. She would sneak into one of the open rooms at her work at Duke and do the ultrasound on herself, right? Because if you had access to an ultrasound machine, wouldn't you do that? It'd be so fun. That was how she found out that something was really, really wrong with her baby. Doctors eventually settled on a diagnosis of limb-body wall complex, which is a rare disorder that causes certain organs to grow outside of a developing baby's body. It was her faith and her unwavering pro-life convictions that motivated Rebecca to continue her pregnancy, even though some women in that position would have chosen to abort the pregnancy. Her church community, which is Summit Church, an evangelical megachurch in Durham, North Carolina, led by the former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, rallied around her. She felt her community really come to her aid. Cora, her daughter, was eventually stillborn. Over the next few years, a lot happened to Rebecca. She and her husband adopted a kid, they had a baby, a healthy girl. Then she got pregnant again. And for some reason, nothing genetic, nothing she did, just like lightning striking twice in the same place, she found that this baby also had a fatal diagnosis, anencephaly, which is a condition in which the skull doesn't grow properly and often parts of the brain are missing. It's a fatal diagnosis, not compatible with life. And she chose, again, to follow her pro-life convictions and carry her baby as long as she could. Her baby, Layla, who she knew as someone who worked in the medical profession, had no chance of living, was born when Rebecca was 36 weeks along, and she was also stillborn. As Rebecca went through this experience, and as she navigated her grief, she found that her views had started changing. Her way of seeing the world, which had always been so clear, started becoming a little fuzzier. These women would seek her out, at church especially, telling her these stories of what they had been through, how ambivalent they felt, how they didn't know what to do. She had one friend in particular named Jen who had been in a similar situation as her and ultimately who chose to have an abortion when she was around 20 weeks along, and it was a wanted pregnancy. And Rebecca watched as she felt that Jen was not really welcomed with her story in their church, that her story wasn't really allowed to be part of the narrative. She wasn't welcomed back with open arms. And Rebecca wanted to have a place to wrestle with all of this, and most of all, she wanted it to be her church. It was the place that she cared about most in the world. Her faith was something that was extremely important to her. But she also felt shut out. She felt that her story and her shifting views on the legality of abortion weren't welcome at a place like Summit. A couple of years ago, Rebecca left her church. She didn't feel like her family was fitting in there anymore, and it wasn't just about the abortion politics, how it was talked about there, but also because she felt that her son, who's adopted and black, was not necessarily going to have a good place there. It wasn't the place where she wanted to raise him. In this case, Rebecca's experience, living out in the hardest way possible her convictions, took her across an invisible boundary, a boundary that made her feel that she could not live in that faith community anymore, that there wasn't enough space in that community to hold her experience and what she had done and her conviction, and also the ways that she had changed. The next story that I have for you is different. It's about people who stay. After George Floyd was murdered in the summer of 2020, I started calling around to people I knew at major evangelical churches and institutions to see how things were going. I started hearing the same casual observation, not even mentioned in the way of being a story. Evangelical leaders, including white ones in predominantly white settings, wanted to get the moment right. They eagerly wanted to talk about race and racism. They wanted to use the right language. They wanted to guide their people in a biblical way. And they also weren't sure how to do it. So there was a set of people that they would call up, associate pastors, worship leaders, people on staff at the church who were people of color. And they would send them Google Docs, drafts of statements that they were writing. They would have them look at tweets before they sent them out to make sure that they weren't terribly catching their foot in their mouth. I started to think of this class of people, as the unofficial racism consultants of the white evangelical world. I called up one of them, a pastor named Philip Pinckney, who's a Southern Baptist who planted a church in South Carolina. And this was in the summer of 2020. He told me in the weeks after George Floyd died, his phone was blowing up with calls from white colleagues seeking advice. 50 or 60 calls in a day, dozens of texts, lots of email chains, so many Google Docs. And it's not that he minded helping or that he didn't want the conversations to happen, but he told me, I don't know any black person who raised their hand and said, yeah, I want to do this. The longer he had spent in that world, the more other things had started to seem like they were the issue as opposed to the Bible. Like whether, for example, a dark-skinned rendering of Jesus could hang on the church wall. It was like there were these years of goodwill that he had to sort of summon out of the air to do this work, even though those years of goodwill actually hadn't been built up. Race has forever been a challenging issue and a defining and dividing one among evangelicals, and particularly among Southern Baptists, of which Philip Pinckney was a part. It's a denomination that was founded to defend slavery. Despite some caricatures, there's been a lot of engagement with this history and with the contemporary implications of this history. The Southern Baptist Convention issued its first apology for its involvement in slavery more than 3 decades ago. A number of leaders have pushed for serious efforts to engage in racial reconciliation within the denomination, to look at the ways that race still continues to divide the denomination. But the fraughtness of our racial politics broadly in America, especially under President Trump and especially in the wake of George Floyd, showed just how unsettled the question of white evangelicals' relationship to race and attitudes towards racism is. J.D. Greer, who was then the president of the Southern Baptist Convention and who was at one time Rebecca Schrader's pastor, as it turns out, put out a statement in a video after George Floyd died saying that Black Lives Matter, even if he didn't support the organization or the activist movement. But even that careful hedge got a lot of pushback. It was controversial for him to say that. As I got to know the unofficial racism, evangelical racism consultants, people who want to be in theologically orthodox spaces, who often chose to be in predominantly white churches, I detected a hint of weariness. Philip told me this: we came into this work to plant churches and disciple people and raise families and to proclaim, thus saith the Lord. And yet there's this blindness, there's this ignorance, there's a hostility that we feel a unique compulsion to move towards. Let me tell you about one final character. Those of you who know your evangelical political history will undoubtedly know the name of Ralph Reed, the evangelical political consultant who has lived 100,000 lives and has seen every dead body when it comes to politics. His was a classic conversion story. As a young man in the early 80s, he was swept up in twin revolutions, the Jesus Revolution and the Reagan Revolution. In 1989, he met Pat Robertson, who was the king of evangelical broadcasting. And at that time, conservative Christians, and particularly Protestant evangelicals, were largely disaggregated and disorganized politically. The voting bloc that we now take for granted as the Christian right had started to form in the 1980s, but there wasn't necessarily organizational infrastructure for mobilizing that energy. Robertson told Ralph Reed that he had a job for him. He wanted Ralph to lead an effort to take operational control of a major political party in the United States, to elect 1,000 faithful Christians at all levels of government, and to win majorities in both the Congress and the Senate. Ralph Reed told me that when he was hearing this as a young man in 1989, he felt like he was going to pass out because this seemed impossible. But slowly, he started to build it, the evangelical political machine. He gathered up church directories and compared them with voter files. He would show up at people's houses to get them to register to vote. He compiled mailing lists that were based on church memberships. He did trainings that helped people make precinct organizations and do get out the vote drives, helped them to write newsletters. And arguably, all this paid off. George W. Bush was seen as an evangelical victory when he was elected, someone whose faith guided his policy that he talked about openly. And in 2016, Reed helped get the band back together again for Donald Trump. He organized a cast of characters who would have been recognizable in the 1990s just as they were in 2016. And he mobilized that machine he had built, this time for a candidate whose relationship with faith seemed a little less personal and a little bit more clearly transactional. Reed, for his part, doesn't regret it for a second. I end with Ralph Reed because above all, politics seems to be the defining can we live together question of the evangelical world. The Trump presidency, at least in the mind of the media, seemed to consolidate this sense of a uniform evangelical monolith, at least a white one. Everyone has always quoted the stats about white evangelicals voting for Trump in droves. In my experience, the last few years of politics have actually been a story of fracture and uncertainty within those communities. It's worth noting that all the issues that I focused on this evening, LGBTQ issues, abortion, race, partisanship, are huge dividing lines in the broader culture that have been refracted into the evangelical world. There's a reciprocal effect in how the culture shapes Christians' responses to these questions, and how Christians, in turn, inform the way the culture handles these questions. Fox News disciples people into how they think and act just as much, or maybe more, as pastors do. I tend to think that the reason why all of this matters comes back to our guy, Tocqueville. He writes in Democracy in America that the habits of democracy are formed at the local level, what we might think of in this story as churches and colleges and denominational bodies. And as these communities struggle to navigate the rancor of our culture, as people leave the church and end friendships, find themselves feeling politically and culturally and theologically homeless, those opportunities to strengthen the habits of democracy are lost. We lose our ability to be in fellowship and community with those we disagree with. We weaken a critical muscle, and a richness is lost. I don't think this challenge is unique to evangelicals or Christian communities, but I certainly find clarity and insight in trying to understand these conflicts in these worlds. Communities where people are trying to break bread together, worship the Lord, and live out their faith, even if in the figuring out, things can get complicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, and she is going to take a seat up here, and I want to invite our other panelists to come forward, and let me introduce Professors Ryan Burge and Eric McDaniel, along with Dr. Guth, Dr. Jim Guth. Ryan Burge, who is to my right, second from the end, is Associate Professor of Political Science at Eastern Illinois University. He earned his BA from Greenville College and an MA and Ph.D. from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He is the author and co-author of 4 books, including The Nuns, 20 Myths About Religion and Politics in America, and his most recent book, The Great De-Churching, which is getting a lot of good press, I think. I think we'll call it good press, yeah. It's very well, it's talked about a lot. So, in addition, he is a pastor of an American Baptist church where he has served for over 17 years. Eric McDaniel at the far end is Associate Professor of Government and the co-director of the Politics of Race and Ethnicity Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. His research examines how the intersection of race and religion influence the American political landscape. His books include Politics in the Pews, The Political Mobilization of Black Churches, and most recently, The Everyday Crusade, Christian Nationalism in American Politics, co-authored with Irfan Nuruddin. I think, is that close enough? Nuruddin. Okay. And Allison Shortle. Currently, he is working on projects examining religious belief systems, religious freedom, and the role of religion in shaping health behavior. Our moderator, Jim Guth, is familiar to most of you. He is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Politics and International Affairs, Senior Distinguished Fellow at the Riley Institute, and Tocqueville Distinguished Scholar. He is a prolific scholar, having authored or edited 5 books and, I counted them, 156 articles. He's really old. No, he's really prolific. And he's here at Furman University. He has won many awards for his teaching and scholarship, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Political Science Association just 2 weeks ago in Los Angeles for his path-breaking work on religion and American politics. Let's welcome our panelists, and I'll turn it over to Jim.
I'd like to start out by having our 2 non-speaking members of the panel address some questions that were raised by our speakers. So First of all, Ryan is sort of the world's expert on the non-religious or seemingly non-religious part of the American electorate. And I'd like to have him address, he's very familiar, of course, with secularization theory and what a lot of people see as the natural tendencies of Western society to become less and less religious over time. The Engelhardt-Norris theory that once you achieve existential security, you're well off and government's taking care of you or somebody's taking care of you. You don't need God anymore. Molly's approach seems to think that there's something there that keeps people religious. Looking at the people you study and are in the process of studying, how do you react to that argument? And I'll make it brief, Ryan.
Oh, God. I want to ask Molly an interesting question that I was thinking about as she was talking. I think it's really interesting that, the main line used to be the dominant strain of Protestant Christianity in America. Going back to the 1950s, half of Americans identified as mainline. For you young people, the main line was like United Methodist, Episcopalian, United Church of Christ. If you go to a church today and they have a female pastor and they're LGBTQ affirming, they're almost always a mainline church. They used to dominate American life. 50% of Americans. Today, about 10% of Americans identify as mainline Protestant. The largest United Methodist Church is the largest mainline church and is having an absolute collapse right now, losing 20% of their church in the last 18 months. 10% of Americans are mainline today. And it's going to be 5% of Americans are mainline in the next 20 years because the average mainline Protestant is now 60 years old. So the mainline is going to disappear as an idea in the American religious landscape. They're always seen as the moderates, the middle voice. So I agree with you, by the way. Pentecostalism is just exploding. So how do you explain the idea that the future of America is going to be like a lot of nuns, right? A lot of atheist, agnostic, nothing particulars, and a lot of like really religious people. Like Pentecostals are not like we go once a year. They're like we go 3 times a week and for 3 hours at a time. So how do you think that's religious polarization? Like how have we lost the middle, moderate, polite part of religion where you went once every month, or like 4 times a year, Christmas and Easter. You said you were Methodist, but you don't really believe in most of it too. You were all Pentecostals, we're all atheists, and there's not a whole lot in between those two things.
I like how you did some judo, and this is a new question for me.
Yeah.
I'll be brief. Well, I think we should sort of disaggregate a few things. I mean, I hear evangelical commentators talk not infrequently about sort of the upside to the decline in church attendance because they see it as the decline of easy cultural Christianity, right? They would say that the kind of Methodist you're describing, who goes once a month or is a creaster, right, just Christmas and Easter, and doesn't really let it impinge on much of their life other than the sort of cultural structures and your social engagements. But that's not Christianity, and so that what's happening is as the center of gravity of world Christianity shifts once again, right? It did not start out as a Western religion. For a while, for some centuries, it was a Western faith. It is not a Western faith anymore. It is a global South, non-white faith. And as that is happening, the costs of being what they would call a real Orthodox Christian have gone up in a way that actually affirms what they see as biblical Christianity. So they would see it as I think, a good development in that sense, sort of purifying. Your question about what's the future of the moderate middle is a super interesting one. And I think one thing that happened to the main line was that they used to be much bigger tents. In an analysis that I've seen by historians of the decline numerically of the main line has pointed out the pattern of kind of clergy, a growing chasm between clergy and many people in the pews on a lot of these political, social, and theological questions, which sometimes resulted in mainliners, and I mean, you've got some data that supports this, like some of them just leave, period, but then some become evangelicals, right? So there's a way in which there was that polarization on that side. I think that we might be seeing a new kind of sorting that produces a new kind of what we might sociologically, theologically, politically label a moderate middle. I mean, especially, I'm a humanist. I don't have any data to support my hypothesis. Who needs data? But But just talking to younger Christians, I don't know, Emma, if this has been your experience, especially younger evangelicals, they have a very complex, nuanced relationship with their parents' generation. I detect among younger, people who grew up in largely white, conservative, evangelical contexts, I detected in them a real desire to distance themselves from what they think the kind of world's view of the Christian right is. They tend to be very pro-life, but really interested in connecting that with a broader ethic of life, much more like what you see having deeper roots in the Catholic tradition, actually, that emphasizes really caring and investing in humans, from the womb to the tomb, as pro-life Christians like to say. And they know they have relationships with LGBTQ people, so while they still often have this sort of traditional conservative view on sexuality, it does not equate to the kind of homophobia that maybe their parents' generation struggled with more. And what this means for voting patterns, I think, is sort of unclear. Now, some of those people are, ex-evangelicals, right? I don't know, I think a lot is still in flux.
Yeah.
But we're seeing a new kind of sorting that might yield a more balanced spectrum, maybe.
Anecdotally, whenever I tell people, when I go to evangelical places and say the main line's collapsing, half the audience goes good, and half the audience goes, that's terrible. And I think that's a really interesting dividing line amongst evangelicals. Do you see the main line as being apostate, or do you see them as being just a different flavor of Protestant Christianity? I think that tells you what kind of evangelical they are, right? They see a big tent, or I'd rather have fewer evangelicals who believe exactly what we believe, or a larger tent who are more moderate in their belief. I think that's really the dividing line amongst modern evangelicals right now, is how big they see that tent.
I'd like to bring Eric into the conversation on the question of race and the division in American religion. Eric's done an awful lot of work on the role of race in American religion, and I'd like to hear his reaction to trends that he sees, both among whites, white Protestants like those Southern Baptists that Emma was talking about, and also maybe something about the charismatic movement in black churches.
Again, thank you so much for having me here. I think one thing that stood out to me as Emma was talking about is there's a Michael Emerson at University of Illinois, Chicago, a sociologist. He's written work related to race and religion. So early on, he was talking. Early work was looking at multiracial congregations. Other works looked at the basis of kind of white evangelicalism as leads to negative attitudes towards blacks, and he's now working on a book called The Grand Betrayal. And this focuses on how blacks are responding to their, evangelical, being in these congregations, but when seeing these things such as George Floyd come up, nobody's talking about it. Or saying, oh, we don't want to talk about, oh, you need to get over that. Not acknowledging the pain of their black congregants. And I think that is somewhat coming to a head where we can worship together, but you won't acknowledge my pain. And in some cases, actually tell me to ignore my pain. And so when I talk tomorrow more about black Protestantism, this is why the black church came about, is because of this need to acknowledge our humanity, acknowledge our pain in a collective manner. But with that, thinking about that with the growth of the black church, this idea of growth of Pentecostalism is historically, black Protestants look more like Pentecostals. And they have very strong faith, and there's been this clear growth of Pentecostalism amongst blacks within the black church. Even though they call themselves Methodist, Baptist, they look like Pentecostals. So the Church of God in Christ is the primary example, but the idea of speaking in tongues is kind of taken off in a variety of congregations. So I guess the question I have for both of you is, one, I guess for Emma, is there going to become a racial reckoning where all of a sudden blacks essentially, no, we have to leave. Like we can't do this anymore, or are they willing to stay? And what will it take for them to stay? But then Molly, for yours, is this growth of Pentecostalism. It might be new for whites, but what does this mean for communities of color? And how they specifically try to wrap around this idea I can manifest my reality in a world where they've run into a bunch of roadblocks from due to a variety of racism and things like that. So how can we think about these groups reconciling that?
Yeah.
Great questions, and I am very much looking forward to your talk tomorrow night. So this question of will they stay, I think has already started shaking out. I'm sure that you've seen this both in your work and anecdotally. Certainly this is something that I saw, especially in reporting starting in 2016, 2020. There's this quiet exodus, and you don't necessarily see it in statistics, right? The polls can't necessarily capture and fine grain. But all of these stories of Black families who said, I just couldn't take my predominantly white Southern Baptist church anymore. We went to a place that felt like it was more home. We went to a multicultural church, we went to a predominantly Black church. It just didn't feel like a place where we could be our whole selves. I've noticed that there are, and this goes back to the point that the evangelical world is tremendously complex and diverse, diverse theologically, diverse culturally, diverse tonally, and of course diverse racially. And I've noticed that there is sometimes a difference in the tonal register of different settings. So for example, urban churches that are church plants, often they are maybe hip and have very cool websites that are Instagrammable, maybe have a different way of talking about, thinking about race, something more open in terms of letting people bring that up and have that be part of the conversation, compared to what you might see as a more traditional suburban megachurch where it might be predominantly white. I think there is diversity within those settings such that people who feel that they want what they would call a theologically orthodox evangelical space may be able to find church homes. But I'm really curious, and I'm as curious as you are, about what happens to those families, those individuals who feel like the places that they found a home for a long time just aren't a home for them anymore. And I think that story is going to continue to shake out, because I don't think racial politics in America are going to get any easier. I don't think just because for now President Trump is in office that this is not a question that's going to come out of church.
Thanks so much for that question, Eric. I guess two major points come to mind. One is there's a really interesting and potentially powerful way Pentecostalism functions as this third category. That is not, it's sort of evangelical, but Pentecostals and evangelicals often they make a very deliberate choice about which adjective they use. It's gotten very messy because charismatic practices have become so widespread. And there's a way in which I think Pentecostals of color, but I'll just say, more broadly, conservative Christians of color, when I interview them, I detect a certain alienation both from the left and the right. There's a desire on the left to think that, well, the real Black Christians are the liberal ones. You saw this, Ruth Graham, the New York Times religion reporter, had a great article a few days ago in the New York Times about devotion to this deceased Black nun in the Midwest. I forget, Arkansas, Missouri, I can't remember. Who she was, because the sisters in her order wanted to move her body to a more sort of revered place, they exhumed her, and they found that, at least by their standards, she had not, her body in the year since she died in 2019, did not show the normal signs of decay. And so they got very excited that this was what Catholics call incorruptibility. This is a sign that she is a sort of miraculous demonstration of God's power and might be a candidate for sainthood. Thousands of pilgrims are coming. And Ruth interviewed some kind of secular commentators who said, well, they're manipulating, the Catholic Church is manipulating this woman because, Black Catholics are really liberal. Like, real Black Catholics are liberal. And it was such an instrumental sort of read. And I think that that's something that Black Protestants generally, but Pentecostals maybe especially run into a lot. On the sexuality questions in particular. On the other hand, for all the reasons that Emma got into, there are all of these sort of friction points and roadblocks in their relations with majority white denominations and majority white churches. And I've talked to a lot of, I guess the folks I've talked to are more official race consultants, because they, like this is how they make their living. But they are like, every day trying to decide, do I stay in this space? But my second point, I think, is more, I don't know, sort of positive, optimistic, and that is that Pentecostalism in particular demands that you consider it in a global context. America is not the frame for Pentecostalism. And Pentecostals more, I think, than other varieties of Christians, with the exception maybe of Catholics, think globally. And they think in terms of their peers and what's going on other continents. And the huge proportions of people coming to Christianity in places like Burma and China because they have these encounters with the miraculous, right? And when you expand your frame of vision and you say the framework is not the American culture wars, you suddenly destabilize all of these polarizing forces, and you have to start confronting the fact that Christians are maybe line up with the Republican Party on certain points, but in other aspects are wildly progressive on sort of economic redistribution or whatever, and your categories don't make sense anymore. And so in that sense, maybe Pentecostals, because of that global impulse and frame, are sort of a dynamic change agent that could be exciting.
Well, I want to get you folks involved. We have a few minutes for some questions of our rather august panel here. Where do we start? Back there. In fact, we have a... Yep. Is there a mic back? Yeah. Do we have... There we go. Okay.
Working all right?
Yeah.
So this really could be a question for all of our great guests. So we've noticed that church attendance has been declining, but at the same time, that's also been juxtaposed with some people getting more and more religious. So there is this polarization that at least one of our panelists have talked about. On the top of that, Christian nationalism, it seems, is on the rise in certain parts of the United States. And this is starting to test the boundary between church and state that we all think is a great measure of how democratic and pluralistic a society is. In fact, this goes from what Dr. Worthen talked about with certain Americans going to gurus that give them advice or an alternate reality. This goes from that local level all the way to potentially the Supreme Court, which has issued rulings in recent years that have let the coach pray and given more people religious liberty, which some people argue is seemingly testing the boundary between church and state. And I'd also like to potentially get Dr. McDaniel's view on this in terms of the Christian nationalism element on this. But this could go to any one of our guests.
Well, let's start out with Eric. He's the one who's written a book on Christian nationalism and has done some very fine work on it.
So thanks for that question. I think one of the things that's important here is the kind of growth of Pentecostalism, I think, has benefited the growth of the idea of Christian nationalism. So one of the things you hear a lot of people talk about with Pentecostalism, somebody's anointed. And I think the idea of a nation being anointed is important. And again, as Molly's pointed out, the Pentecostals think about it in a global sense or a subsection. A subset said, no, we're special. We're the ones. We are the city up on a hill, and people run with that. And I think one thing that a lot of people have pointed to is that a lot of this kind of this distrust of science, on both on the left and the right. I mean, people on the left complained about people on the right not trusting the vaccine. Even though, well, the scientists say it's safe, but but they don't acknowledge the fact that they were so highly against genetically modified foods, even though the scientists said it was safe. It was like, okay, which one, when are you going to listen to the scientists, when are you not? I do think that we are in the midst of, now some would argue that is this really about religion, or is this really about putting forth a certain racial gendered hierarchy? So if you look at the work of someone like Kristen Coates-Domain and her book Jesus and John Wayne, also if you look at the work of Phil Gorski and Sam Perry, they would argue that no, this is the theological arm of a white male supremacist movement. If you look at kind of what they're saying, but you see the actions of the governor of Oklahoma, who declared the state for Jesus, who says we're going to fund religious schools, as basically trying to set up that fight at the Supreme Court. I think the problem, the big problem I think we're going to run into with Christian nationalism is something that I think the black church has wrestled with and others have wrestled with, is what will a Christian nation look like? And there have been a lot of kind of classic black religious scholars who argued, can we consider people who are slave-holding Christians real Christians? Can we consider people who allow for lynching and allow for all these things to happen to be real Christians? Are we really a Christian nation if we allow those things? How are we violating these things? And so, in many ways, Christian nationalism in the hands of certain groups may actually call to task the nation. So if you think of King's rhetoric, if you think of a variety of William Barber III's rhetoric, that there's a variety of black religious leaders that are invoking Christian nationalism to cast shame on the nation for its racial history. I do think Christian nationalism is something that a lot of people are using. I don't think they've defined it really well. And it's one of those things of, it's great as a rallying cry, but once you win, such as with the overturning Roe v. Wade, we saw people like, yeah, overturn Roe v. Wade. Then it's overturned, but whoa, we don't want to do all this. It's, you want to win, but you don't know what to do once you win it. It's a great way to mobilize, but once you actually get there, what are you able to accomplish? And again, this idea of Christian nationalism goes back to this question of, what kind of Christian nation will we be?
Other question? Yes.
So this is mostly for Ms. Green, but anyone can answer, but it's mostly about your abortion anecdote, and something I found that a lot of times in terms of abortion arguments, the not necessarily strongest arguments, but the most fervent tend to be anecdotes, whether, there were the ones on the left, like I was raped, I was abortion, but on the other side it's, I was supposed to be aborted, but I wasn't, now I'm living, I'd be dead if I wasn't. But I realized that these are all subjective, and we don't tend to get to objective arguments like, what is a human life, why is a human life sacred, when does abortion, when it should be legal, but when does it become murder? And I've seen this on college campuses, but probably religious stuff with, that we just can't argue the metaphysical questions and objectivity. And my question is, what do you think is stopping us from having these questions about objectivity, and what do you think we could do to actually start talking to each other about, when is life sacred?
Great question, and I would encourage you to try to have those conversations with your friends in class, because I think it's an important issue to engage with deeply. I would take issue a little bit with your use of the term objectivity, in the sense that you seem to be setting up a contrast between personal experience and anecdote as being less valid or less morally informative than perhaps reasoned arguments. And in my experience, reporting on abortion, which I've done quite a bit, especially in my reporting on religion and politics, people come to this question with all sorts of opinions and reasoned arguments, but they also come as human beings. It's a deeply personal, deeply encounter-based topic, because there's nothing more intimate than people's experiences of pregnancy, a family, a child, of loss. I think Rebecca, who I was talking about earlier in my talk, really embodies this, because as I was interviewing her, I was trying to get to what her actual view on abortion is today. She believes that abortion should be legal in most cases. She agreed that Roe was a good limit, but she kept on coming back to this discomfort that she had, where she kept saying, but I'm personally opposed to abortion. And I kept saying, what does that mean to be personally opposed to abortion, but believing that abortion should be legal in most cases? And she had tremendous empathy for women who seek abortions. Her experiences had helped to open her eyes to people's reasons for doing that, even though that wasn't the path that she took. And yet, there was something in her morally that felt that she couldn't get past this belief that she had, which is that an unborn life is an unborn life. If you gestate an unborn life, it will be a baby. And that gray, that ambiguity, that sense of personal experience running up against objective arguments, I think that's where a lot of people are on abortion. So I guess what I would encourage you to do is first to continue to try to engage this question, because it seems like one of interest to you, but also to make space for moral reasoning that comes from lots of different places, because this is a very, very complex question, complex religiously, spiritually, morally, legally, culturally, politically, every kind of lee that you could come up with. So take the complexity and run with it.
Well, just wait real quick. I wrote a piece called "Liberals Have Won the Culture War," looking like the last 50 years of data on marijuana, same-sex marriage, extramarital sex, and pornography. And if you look at all four of those issues, like we've moved dramatically in the favor of legalization of marijuana, same-sex marriage being legalized, extramarital sex is not always wrong, and pornography should not be banned. Abortion hasn't really moved in the last, it's the weirdest issue, because it's the classic centerpiece of the culture war. Like, you cannot get any more, and every other issue has moved left, except that one. And I've had so many conversations with really thoughtful people about why that is, and there's something so visceral about abortion, I think. You know, the pictures of the silent screen, if you grew up evangelical, you saw that video, and there's just something different about abortion, that it does not track clearly one way, left or right. It almost stays exactly where it is right now. And I do think Dobbs has sort of messed that up a little bit, but you're never going to see 80% of Americans be one way or the other on the question of abortion. I just don't see that happening like you're seeing on marijuana and same-sex marriage right now. You will never see that on abortion for whatever reason. It operates in a different level than those other social issues.
Write that prediction down
Write it down.
and contact Ryan in 20 years.
I just have one addendum. I completely agree that abortion has this personal dimension that shapes everyone's relationship with that issue in a special way. But I also think that one of the dynamics is that younger women who grew up after second-wave feminism do not equate the ending of a pregnancy with a claim of bodily feminist autonomy. It doesn't hold together logically. They are far more likely to be persuaded that it's actually murder. And it has nothing to do with my autonomy as a human and being treated equally as a woman. So they're not persuaded by that argument that I think worked on an older generation of women.
I guess one thing to add to it that Emma pointed out, there's a video op-ed by a pastor at Wayman AME Church in St. Louis, where he talks about how he was staunchly opposed to abortion, but then he talks about this one example. And he said, personally, I'm opposed to it, but I do not want to impose this upon you. And I think that's where, if you think about the example you gave, this person like, I couldn't do it, but I should not stop you from doing it. And it's interesting to see this, is that it's your choice, not mine. And really, what role should the government play in this? And should the government have a say or should it not have a say? And should I be able to use the government to dictate what you can and can't do? So I think that might become the new, well, it's pro-choice, but it's framing it a completely different way of saying, I don't like abortion, but I will not impose it upon you.
Can I ask you a question about that? So it's interesting, right? Because if you think something is murder, we're not used to thinking about murder as a matter of subjective judgment, right? So do you think, is the source of the ambiguity or the willingness to privatize it, is it simply can it simultaneously be true that pastor thinks in a deep convicted way that it is murder, and yet recognizes that in the sort of public sphere, there is ambiguity about when life begins. So it's a very difficult tension to hold, right? In something as profound as ending a life. So is it a philosophical, what is the source of the ambiguity exactly?
At least from the way he explained it, was the issue was, it wasn't that the woman had a problematic pregnancy. She was very young, but she was able to do so much more. And I think it was the idea of her being able to get out of poverty, be able to do these things, and it's seen as like, me personally, I wouldn't do that, but I understand why you did it. It's I wouldn't do that, but the fact that you did it, there's a reason behind this, and that I understand that you have greater needs, and that this would have held you back drastically. And so it was kind of that argument, which in some cases people say, well, that's very selfish of you. But I think in his mind, it was like, no, this person had to get out of poverty, and this was not a way this person could get out of poverty. And in fact, the child may have actually been in greater harm had the child been born.
Boy, if you want to continue this conversation, come back tomorrow night. We'll have more of this, and I hope you do come back with these kinds of questions, because this is where we're at. I want to ask a question, but I won't. I have time later. We have tomorrow. As we wrap up this evening, let me invite you to tomorrow's public event, which will be held in the Watkins Room at 5 p.m. We will hear from Professors Burge and McDaniel, and then put the band back together again for another interesting discussion. That's tomorrow night in the Watkins Room at 5 p.m. All right, so now let's show our appreciation to our speakers, and you are dismissed.